On a freezing winter morning, a former Navy SEAL walked into an animal shelter with a purpose no one knew. At the end of the kennel row, a silent German shepherd had rejected 20 families, as if it were waiting for the one person meant to find it. Beneath the warm smiles,
Thank you all for
adoption
coming.
papers, and glowing
It's
lights,
wonderful to see so
a dark
many
secret
families
was
here
quietly
today.
moving through that shelter every night. No one knew the dog had already survived fire once, and now it was watching the truth come back for it. This is not just a story about a misunderstood dog, but a battle between quiet loyalty and hidden evil. Tell us where you're watching from, and don't forget to like and subscribe to help this channel reach 1,000 followers. And now, let's begin the story. Below the bright winter sky of northern Montana, the animal shelter looked almost too cheerful to hide anything dark. Snow clung in thin white seams along the fence posts and the edges of the roof. A row of colorful paper banners had been tied over the front gate for the annual adoption event, and every time the wind moved through, they fluttered like cheerful flags over a battlefield no one else could see. Families stood outside with red cheeks and gloved hands, stamping warmth into their boots, laughing softly, waiting for the doors to open. Kyle Rowan arrived 5 minutes early. He always arrived early. At 35, Kyle still carried the shape of military discipline as if it had been carved into his bones. He stood around 6 feet tall, lean and compact rather than bulky, built like a man trained for endurance instead of display. His face was clean-shaven, the sharp square of his jaw and the defined planes of his cheekbones exposed to the cold. Dark brown hair, cut in a practical military style but slightly longer than strict regulation, stirred in the winter wind. His skin was fair beneath the northern weathering, wind-burned along the cheek and temple. His eyes were gray-blue, steady and unreadable, the eyes of a man who had learned to watch first and judge later. His clothes did not belong to a ceremony. They belonged to work. An old military gray tactical combat shirt, softened by years of use and weather, clung to his shoulders and arms. The cuffs and seams were faintly frayed. Under it, a dark red thermal layer showed at the throat. His old combat pants, somewhere between earth brown and moss green, had worn knees and sagging cargo pockets. His work boots were scarred. A battered military watch sat on his wrist like a habit he had never thought to break. To everyone else, he looked like what he claimed to be that morning. A volunteer trainer, a quiet ex-serviceman donating time to help dogs settle before adoption. That was true. It was just not the whole truth. He paused near the sign-in table and let his attention move the way it had been trained to move years ago, never in a straight line, never, obviously. He noted the front entrance, the side corridor that led to the kennel wing, the rear service door partly visible through the building gap, and the camera mounted above the office corner. Then he let his gaze drift away, as if he had only been admiring the decorations. A woman in her late 30s greeted him from behind the folding table. Her name tag read, Mara Ellison. She had the tired competence of someone who held fragile things together for a living. Medium height, practical build, pale winter skin, and brown hair twisted into a loose knot that had begun to unravel by morning. Mara wore a shelter sweatshirt under a quilted vest and spoke with brisk warmth. She smiled easily, but it was the smile of someone who had learned to keep moving even when trust had become expensive. "Kyle Rowan?" she asked. He nodded. "Glad you made it. Sign here. We may need help once the dogs start rotating out." He took the clipboard. His handwriting was quick and controlled. He moved through the form without pause until he reached the line asking for availability. He stopped there for the briefest beat. Day shifts, evening shifts, overnight support. Then he checked the box for overnight support. Mara didn't seem to notice. "You've worked with dogs before?" "A little." That earned the faintest lift of one eyebrow. Men who answered like that usually had either no experience at all or far too much to explain casually. Mara seemed to decide not to press. Well, today's the easy part. Mostly introductions. We try to keep it warm, low pressure, hopeful. Hopeful. Kyle almost smiled at the word. He had not come because of hope. 2 weeks earlier, an old contact from a freight security unit had passed him something unofficial and incomplete. Irregular transport records, mislabeled cargo movements, shelter origin dogs disappearing into private training channels across northern states. No names, no case, no court-worthy evidence. Just enough smoke to tell a careful man there might be fire. The shelter in Windhaven Ridge had appeared twice in those fragments. Not enough for police. Enough for him. Families began to filter into the main hall as the event opened. The room smelled of pine disinfectant, wet boots, dog fur, and the sugary coffee someone had donated in cardboard carriers. Children laughed too loudly. An elderly man in a wool coat bent stiffly to accept the enthusiastic affection of a golden retriever whose honey-colored tail seemed determined to wag the whole winter loose from the walls. Near the center aisle, a white poodle with apricot-tinted ears trotted straight to a small boy and placed one neat paw on his knee, so delicate and confident that half the room sighed at once. Kyle let the joy of it move around him without entering it. He stood just outside the current of it, close enough to belong, far enough to see the edges. That was when he noticed Silas Vane. Silas was the kind of man people relaxed around before they understood why they shouldn't. He was probably in his early 50s, tall and elegant without appearing soft, his charcoal wool coat tailored clean through the shoulders, gloves the kind of leather that never saw hard labor, hair silver gray and combed neatly back from a narrow, intelligent face. He was handsome in a polished, bloodless way. Even his smile seemed professionally measured, never too wide, never careless. Around him, staff straightened. Guests thanked him for his generosity. Someone mentioned the new security upgrade his foundation had helped fund last year. He accepted gratitude like it was his natural climate. But he did not touch a single dog. Not once. He watched them. He listened when staff mentioned temperament, health, trainability. Once, when a volunteer held up a printed list to discuss which dogs still needed stronger placements, Silas's gaze dropped to the page and stayed there just a little too long. Not warm interest, not sentimental pride. Inventory. Kyle kept his face still. He did not look at Silas again right away. Instead, he watched reflections in the office glass, the shift of people moving around him, the way one male staffer in a shelter jacket kept drifting in and out of the rear corridor without ever settling into the public event. Young, maybe late 20s, narrow shoulders, pale skin, eyes that avoided other eyes. He carried himself with the nervous speed of a man who wanted to seem busy before anyone thought to ask what exactly he was doing. Then the room changed. It was subtle at first. The laughter thinned. A handler by the side door gave a short, uncertain tug on a leash. A German shepherd entered the hall. He did not bound forward like the others. He did not scan the room with hopeful confusion. He stepped in, stopped, and stood as if the floor itself had told him not to move again. He was beautiful in the worn way a thing can be beautiful after surviving more than it should have. Around 5 or 6 years old, strong through the chest and shoulders but leaner than he ought to be, he carried the cream-gray-black sable coloring of a working-line shepherd. A black harness with a dark red trim sat against his coat, the red muted enough not to look decorative. His ears were upright, but not easy. His amber eyes flickered once across the room and then away, as if eye contact cost him something. "This is Voss," Mara said quietly, coming to stand near Kyle. "He's complicated." The word felt too small. A family tried first. A mother crouched, smiling softly, Her daughter held out both hands. A father waited a little back, already hoping. Voss gave them one brief look, then turned and walked straight toward the wall beside the folding crate stations. He sat with controlled precision and angled his face away from the room. Not fear, not aggression, withdrawal. Kyle watched the muscles along the dog's neck. The stillness was too deliberate, too practiced. 20 returns, Mara said under her breath. Healthy, hearing normal, no bite incidents, doesn't respond to commands, doesn't bond, doesn't play. It's like... She exhaled. It's like he refuses to live where everyone else is. Kyle said nothing. Silas crossed the far side of the hall, speaking with 2 donors. He did not come near Voss. He didn't have to. The shepherd changed before Cale's eyes. Not much. Just enough. A tightening through the shoulders, ears lowering 1 fraction. Breath held. Then Voss turned his head farther away, toward the blank wall, faster than before, as if the sight, scent, or sound of that man had touched a nerve already worn raw. Kyle shifted his own position 2 steps to the left, pretending to clear space for a family with a stroller. From there he had a cleaner line of sight. Voss was not shutting down at random. He was reacting. And the reaction had direction. A strange unease slid through Cale, not panic, not surprise, something colder. Confirmation was always quieter than discovery. It did not explode. It settled. Halfway through the event, he found the camera monitor in the office visible through a cracked doorway. One screen glitched for a fraction of a second static across the rear kennel corridor, then normal again. No one else seemed to notice. He did. And because he did, the question he had carried into the building began to shift shape. Before, it had been a possibility, a rumor with paperwork behind it. Now it had posture, timing, eyes. Later, when the hall was at its busiest, and a child started crying because her chosen puppy had run to another family instead, Kyle saw something that pulled every loose thread tighter. The nervous young staffer from the rear corridor stepped past Voss without speaking. The man made almost no sound, no command, no invitation. But as he moved by, his hand twitched once at thigh level in a small, nearly meaningless motion. Voss's eyes snapped to it, only for a second. Then he looked away again. Cale felt the cold inside the room deepen, not because he understood it, because he didn't. And the dog did. The event wound down by mid-afternoon. Families left with leashes, paperwork, tears, gratitude, and hopeful promises. Snowlight turned thin and blue outside the windows. The Golden had gone home with the old man. The poodle had chosen the little boy, and kept choosing him every 30 seconds after that, as if making sure the universe did not change its mind. Voss went back to his kennel. No scene. No resistance. Just a quiet return to the place where no one expected anything from him except disappointment. Kyle found himself standing outside the kennel run longer than necessary. The shepherd sat in the back corner, body aligned with the wall, face turned from the bars. Up close, the dog's control felt even stranger. Not vacant, not broken. Tense in the way sealed doors are tense. "People say he doesn't care," Mara said softly from behind him. "I don't think that's true." Kyle looked at her. She folded her arms against the cold and leaned one shoulder against the frame. "I think he cares about something we're not giving him." He glanced back toward Voss. "Who handles the night shift?" "Depends. Usually one of us and one kennel assistant." "Usually?" She studied him for a moment, hearing the weight in a simple question. "Why?" Kyle let a beat pass. "No reason. Just learning the place." Mara nodded, but not fully convinced. Beyond the kennel windows, dusk pressed blue into the snow. Somewhere in the building, metal clanged softly. Farther away, someone laughed while stacking empty adoption crates. Normal sounds, shelter sounds, a place trying very hard to be ordinary. Cale slipped one hand into his pocket and felt the folded note he had brought with him that morning. Times, shipments, 2 shelter names, 1 dead-end warehouse number. Thin paper. Thin evidence. He looked at Voss again. The dog did not turn, but one ear tilted back, not toward the hallway, not toward Mara, toward him. That was enough. Not trust, not yet, but enough. Cale stepped away from the kennel and looked back down the corridor toward the rear service exit, where the shadows gathered early and the air seemed colder than the rest of the building. He had come to confirm whether something hidden was alive inside this place. By the end of the day, he no longer needed to ask that question. The only question left was how deep it went. Cale came back the next morning before the sun had fully cleared the ridge. The shelter looked different without the noise of families and paper banners and hopeful voices. In daylight after celebration, it became what it really was, a working place built on routine, fatigue, and small acts of mercy repeated until they no longer looked heroic. Snow had packed itself into the tire grooves of the parking lot and hardened overnight. The wind had a sharper edge now. It came off the hills with the clean, punishing smell of pine and frozen metal. Inside, the heat was thin and practical. The front hall no longer smelled of coffee and excitement. It smelled of bleach, damp fur, canned food, wet mop water, and the quiet animal patience that settled into a building when nobody was trying to make it look beautiful. Mara was already there. In morning light, she seemed even more real than she had the day before. Her brown hair was tied up more securely now, but loose strands had escaped around her face. She was wearing the same tired vest over a thermal shirt, sleeves pushed up, exposing pale wrists reddened by cold water and work. There was nothing dramatic about her. She had the posture of a person who had learned to carry urgency without showing panic. Even her kindness was efficient. "You're early again," she said, looking up from a stack of intake folders. Kyle shrugged out of the cold and closed the door behind him. Couldn't sleep. That was not entirely a lie. He had spent half the night in the rented room above a hardware store 2 blocks away, staring at the ceiling and going over the details from the previous day. Not the obvious ones. The obvious ones were almost never the dangerous ones. It was the edges that mattered. The rear corridor, the camera glitch, Silas Vane's hands never touching a dog. The shelter worker with the narrow shoulders moving like a man already halfway to somewhere else. And Voss, sitting motionless with his face turned away from the world, except when the world gave itself away. Mara slid a clipboard toward him. "If you're really volunteering, I can put you to work. Please do." She gave him a look that suggested she still had not decided what kind of man he was. "Kennel checks first. Water bowls, gates, bedding. Then I'll show you the file room if you still want to help sort behavior notes." Behavior notes. That almost sounded generous. Kyle took the clipboard and moved toward the kennel wing. He kept his pace casual, but his mind had already sharpened. Working inside a place was different from observing it. Once people stopped watching you as a guest, they stopped editing themselves around you. The kennel corridor was long, narrow, and lined with chain-link enclosures, whose floors reflected the weak overhead light in dull gray patches. A few dogs barked when he entered. A few wagged hopefully. One hound mix rolled onto its back against the gate like an overcommitted actor trying out for the role of beloved family pet. Kyle checked bowls, latches, blankets. He moved steadily, quietly. When he reached Voss's kennel, the shepherd did not come forward. Voss sat in the back corner the way he had the day before, body aligned with the wall, head turned just enough to avoid full contact with the room. Up close, he looked older than 6 in the eyes, and younger in the body. His coat was thick, but not perfectly kept, sable fur paling to cream along the chest and underside, darkening in smoky gray and black over the back. The black harness with deep red trim sat cleanly against him, practical and restrained. No decorative tags, no cheap shelter collar jingling for attention. His ears were upright but tense, catching details while pretending not to care. Kyle crouched outside the kennel without speaking. For a while, nothing happened. Then Kyle shifted the clipboard from one hand to the other. Voss's eyes moved immediately, not to his face, to his hand, a precise, clean tracking movement, too fast to be random, too selective to be ordinary curiosity. Kyle stayed where he was. He did not repeat the motion. He did not test anything yet. Curiosity was useful. Pressure ruined things. After a few seconds, Voss turned away again, but not as completely as before. One ear remained subtly angled back, holding Kyle inside its attention. That was enough to confirm what yesterday had suggested. The dog did not ignore the world. He filtered it. Kyle finished the checks and carried the clipboard back to the front office. Mara was sorting folders by date. Behind her, a steel filing cabinet stood half open. Near the desk was a wall monitor showing 4 security feeds. One camera displayed the kennel hall, another the front entrance. A third showed the fenced exercise yard. The fourth, labeled rear service corridor, flickered once, then stabilized. Kyle set the clipboard down. "You said behavior notes?" Mara looked relieved to hand them over. "Top drawer, alphabetized in theory and ruined in practice. Start with the dog still unplaced after 60 days. He opened the drawer and sat at the corner desk. The paperwork smelled faintly of dust and cardboard. Most of it was exactly what it should have been. Temperament logs, vaccination dates, food preferences, adoption returns with reasons that were sad in familiar ways. Too energetic. Not good with cats. Owner moved. Child allergic. Elderly owner hospitalized. 100 quiet failures that had nothing to do with malice. Then the pattern started to show. Not dramatic, just wrong. 3 dogs listed as transferred to partner placements with incomplete destination fields. One file with an intake photo but no final adoption signature. Another with transport initials that did not match the receiving organization code. A shepherd mix marked private training recommendation in handwriting different from the rest of the sheet. Kyle did not stop turning pages. He just slowed slightly. "Mara," he said without looking up, "who usually handles off-site transfers?" "Depends. Why?" "Some of these signatures don't match." That brought her over. She leaned beside him, scanning the page. Her face tightened, not with fear, but with irritation first, the reflex of someone whose first instinct was to fix an error before imagining a crime. "Could be paperwork sloppiness. We've had turnover." "How much turnover?" "Too much." She said it dryly, but the answer carried weight. Before he could ask more, footsteps passed the office door. Kyle glanced up. It was the same young staffer from yesterday. Narrow-faced, late 20s at most, with pale skin that never seemed to fully warm and light brown hair cropped too short to hide the shape of his skull. He wore a shelter jacket with the name Nate stitched over the breast in faded thread. His mouth was soft in a way that would have made him look harmless if not for the chronic tightness around the eyes. Those eyes never stayed on anyone long. Men who lied for a living often learned to overcompensate with charm. Nate had not. He had the more dangerous habit of trying to disappear while standing in plain sight. "Nate," Mara called, "did you restock the rear cabinet?" "Almost," he said. His voice was ordinary. That somehow made it worse. He moved on before the conversation could grow roots. Kyle watched his reflection pass across the office glass. Mara followed the direction of his gaze, then said too quickly, "He's new. Still settling in." Kyle turned another page. "Seems nervous. Everyone's nervous lately." "Why?" She hesitated. That was more useful than an answer. Mid-morning, while Mara was in the exam room with a limping beagle and the front office stood briefly empty, Cale took a stack of folders back toward the file shelves near the kennel entrance. He was halfway down the corridor when he heard no bark, no growl, no commotion at all, just the minute scrape of metal against concrete. He stopped. Voss was still seated in the back of his kennel, but one of the latches 2 enclosures down was moving, not opening, testing. A hand withdrew from the edge of the partition before Cale could see whose it was. The corridor was empty when he looked up. Voss had not moved from his corner, yet his gaze was fixed not on the wall now, but on the exact place where the unseen hand had vanished. For one strange second, Kyle had the unsettling impression that the dog had been waiting for him to notice. Then Voss blinked once and turned his face away again, leaving behind nothing except the chill running quietly beneath Kyle's ribs. By noon, the shelter had resumed its weekday rhythm. Dogs rotated through short yard breaks. A volunteer scrubbed food trays in the back sink. Snowlight shifted along the floor like something searching for cracks. Kyle spent the next hour helping Mara reorganize the transfer cabinet. She talked more when her hands were busy. He learned she had been at the shelter for nearly 7 years. Before that, she had worked at a veterinary clinic in Billings. She had once adopted out a cattle dog to a man who had seemed gentle, stable, perfect on paper. 3 months later, the dog had been found chained behind a salvage yard. Since then, Mara trusted slowly and paperwork more than promises. It explained something about the way she ran this place. It also explained why disorder in her files bothered her enough that she began checking them herself once Kyle pointed out the inconsistencies. "These should have destination confirmations," she murmured, flipping one page, then another. "And this transport code is wrong. It doesn't even belong to our partner list." Kyle said nothing. He did not need to push. She was seeing it now. By late afternoon, he returned to the kennels under the excuse of another round of latch checks. Nate was nowhere in sight. The rear corridor camera on the office monitor had flickered twice more that day. Too brief to prove sabotage, too consistent to be innocent. When Cale reached Voss again, the shepherd was standing this time. Not near the gate, not exactly waiting, just no longer folded into the wall as completely as before. Kyle stopped a few feet back. "You hear more than they think," he said quietly. Voss did not react to the voice. Kyle lifted his hand, not toward the dog, only toward the latch, slow and visible. Amber eyes locked onto his fingers at once. Kyle lowered the hand. Voss's attention held for half a second longer before easing off. There it was again. Not obedience, recognition. Kyle looked down at the worn concrete floor of the kennel, at the water bowl, the folded blanket, the thin strip of winter light, and felt the shape of the chapter ahead beginning to form in his mind. Missing files, wrong codes, a nervous staffer, a rear camera that blinked at the wrong moments, a donor with access and polished hands, and one dog who tracked movement like language and fear like memory. He straightened slowly. At the end of the corridor, through the narrow window in the rear door, dusk was gathering over the parking lot. Snow had begun again, light but steady, covering yesterday's tire marks one quiet layer at a time. Kyle stood there for a moment and understood something simple and unwelcome. Whatever had happened here before him had happened more than once, and whatever was still happening had learned how to hide inside ordinary routines. Behind him, Voss shifted his weight with the faintest sound. Kyle looked back. The shepherd had not come closer. He had not softened. He had not offered trust. But he was no longer facing the wall. Not completely. For now, that was as close as truth ever came before it was ready to be seen. By the time night settled over Windhaven Ridge, the shelter had become a different creature. In daylight, it was a place of lists and clipped voices, of damp leashes, stainless steel bowls, and the thin, stubborn hope that clung to every kennel door. At night, all those practical things seemed to withdraw into the walls. What remained was simpler and older. Breathing, listening, waiting. Snow moved past the windows in a fine, slanting veil, so light it looked less like weather than like ash that had forgotten how to fall. The sky outside was moonless, a dark iron lid over the valley. The parking lot lamps cast cones of pale gold over drifts and tire tracks, but beyond that small artificial glow, the world disappeared into pine shadow and cold. Kyle had volunteered for the overnight shift without needing to be asked twice. He wore the same faded military gray tactical shirt, the same dark red thermal beneath it, the same worn combat pants and old work boots that sounded heavier at night on the shelter's concrete floors. There was something about working in darkness that made old instincts return whole. He found himself measuring distance without thinking, cataloging blind spots, tracing entries and exits in his head until the building became less a shelter than a map of vulnerabilities. Mara had stayed later than usual, trying to reorganize paperwork that now troubled her in a way it clearly had not 2 days earlier. The strain showed more plainly tonight. Her shoulders were set higher. Her voice had thinned at the edges. She moved with a determined efficiency that only made her exhaustion more obvious. Under the fluorescent lights, her pale skin looked almost translucent, and the loose brown hair escaping her knot gave her the look of someone whose mind had started running ahead of her body hours ago. "You really didn't have to take the late part," she told him as they stood in the office near the security monitor. "I could have handled it." Kyle leaned against the desk, his gray-blue eyes on the rear corridor feed. "You said the nights are when the place feels emptiest." Mara crossed her arms. "That wasn't an invitation." "No," he said. "It was information." That drew the faintest, tired huff from her. Not laughter exactly, but the memory of it. "You always answer like that?" "Only when I'm trying to be charming." She looked at him then, properly, as if weighing whether he was joking. With Kyle, the trouble was that he almost never smiled when he said something dry. His face stayed cut from the same hard grain, square jaw, wind-roughened fair skin, dark brown hair clipped short, eyes that had watched too much and never advertised it. He was not cold, exactly, just contained, like someone who had once learned the cost of letting emotion get ahead of observation and had never quite forgiven himself for it. "I'll be in the file room another 20 minutes, Mara said. "Then I'm heading upstairs to crash on the office cot. If anything feels off, you wake me." Kyle nodded. She hesitated, one hand on the file cabinet. "You think something's going to happen tonight?" It was not a question, not really. Kyle let the silence sit between them for a second. The monitor flickered faintly over his shoulder, washing the office wall in shifting gray light. "I think," he said at last, "that whatever has been happening here didn't stop because we noticed." Mara swallowed. "That's not comforting." "It wasn't meant to be." She left him with that, and disappeared into the adjoining room, carrying a stack of folders like paper alone might still be enough to save a place from corruption. The shelter quieted by degrees. A few dogs gave half-hearted barks as the last rounds were made. A hound muttered in its sleep. Somewhere deeper in the building, water pipes ticked with cold. Kyle walked the main corridor slowly, checking latches with an easy hand, never rushing. He did not shine his flashlight where cameras could catch the beam. He did not pause too long in one place. He had spent enough years around men who watched patterns to know how not to offer one. When he reached Voss's kennel, the German shepherd was awake. He stood near the back wall, not pressed against it tonight, just holding himself in that same severe stillness that made him seem less like a dog and more like a thought that refused to dissolve. In the weak overhead light, his sable coat looked darker, the black and gray over his back almost smoke-colored, his cream chest barely visible. The red-trimmed black harness remained fitted to him, utilitarian and neat. His amber eyes found Kyle's hands first, as they always did, then lifted briefly toward his face before sliding away. Kyle stopped outside the gate. For a moment, neither moved. He had spent the day pretending not to test things, but night altered the rules. Slowly, deliberately, he lifted his hand to waist level and shifted the flashlight from one palm to the other. Voss's gaze snapped to the motion. No hesitation. No confusion. Only sharp, contained attention. Kyle lowered his hand again. Voss's ears twitched once. Then the shepherd turned his head, not fully away, but enough to end the exchange on his own terms. It was the closest thing to a conversation they had yet had. Cale went on. At 11:17, the rear corridor camera fuzzed for less than a second. At 11:34, a side service light went dark, then came back on. At 11:49, he caught the faint scent of something out of place, thin, oily, wrong. Not enough to alarm a civilian at once, enough for him. Gasoline, not fresh, not strong, hidden under bleach, wet concrete, and kennel air. But there. He went still. The smell seemed to come and go with the heating vents, a ghost moving through the building. He looked toward the rear door. The corridor beyond sat under flat fluorescent light, empty and ordinary, the way dangerous things often did just before they stopped pretending. Kyle turned and headed for the office. Mara was crouched beside a banker's box of files when he stepped in. "Do we store fuel anywhere in the building?" She looked up sharply. "What?" "Any maintenance supply, lawn equipment, cleaning solvents." "No, shed outside near the fence." "Why?" He was about to answer when the lights in the rear hall flickered. Just once. Mara stood so quickly one folder slid from her hand to the floor. "That's the second time this week." Kyle was already moving. He took the corridor at a controlled pace that felt slow only because everything in him had accelerated. Halfway there, the smell hit harder. Hit. Gasoline now, unmistakable, carried on heated air and the first bitter edge of something beginning to burn. Then came the sound. Not barking. A hard metallic pop from the back utility area, followed by a muffled whoomph of fire, finding what it had been offered. "Wake the upstairs volunteer and call 911, Kyle said, his voice suddenly all command. "Now." Mara didn't argue. Fear sharpened people either into confusion or obedience. Tonight it made her useful. She turned and ran. By the time Kyle reached the rear kennel section, orange light was already blooming under the doorframe at floor level, too fast and too low to be an accident. Smoke folded into the hallway in greasy gray sheets. Somewhere beyond it, dogs had begun to bark in earnest, now high, frantic, collective. Kyle yanked his shirt collar over his mouth and shoulder hit the first door open. Heat slammed into him. The back row of kennels was half obscured by smoke, but one truth showed itself instantly. The fire had not started in chaos. It had been placed. Flames crawled along a line near the wall, as if following a poured path, licking up storage crates and old cardboard, building a barrier between the front entrance to the run and the rear service exit. And that rear exit stood open, not wide, not enough to attract attention at a glance. Enough. Kyle moved for the first kennel latch. Then he heard it, a long rising sound that cut through the barking and the crackle of flame. Voss. It was not a panicked noise, not random. The shepherd stood 2 runs down, framed by smoke and cage shadow, head high, body taut, giving voice to something older than fear. A warning. A call. A command to move. One by one, the nearby dogs began rushing the front of their kennels. Kyle worked fast. 1 latch, 2, 3. Dogs burst past him, claws skidding on concrete, yelping, choking, running toward the clearer front hall. He kept low, opening gates, waving animals through, eyes already burning. Somewhere overhead, something snapped and dropped sparks. Then he saw movement at the rear exit, a figure slipping through the haze. Male, medium height, shelter jacket. Nate, not running wildly, not trapped, moving with the purposeful haste of someone trying to leave before the story finished writing itself. And behind him, another shape near the threshold, larger, broader in coat and posture, turning once as if checking the progress of the fire before stepping back into darkness beyond the door. Kyle only caught a profile, a clean coat collar, gloved hand, controlled stillness. Silas Vane did not belong inside a burning kennel at midnight. Yet some part of Cale knew, before his mind finished the sentence, that he had just seen exactly that. For one suspended moment, as smoke rolled low and hot around the cages, Voss did something stranger than any training response. He did not run for the open corridor when Kyle unlatched his kennel. He turned instead and planted himself in front of the last occupied run on the end, where a terrified old collie mix had collapsed and refused to move. Through the smoke, Cale saw Voss shove his body against the smaller dog once, twice, then stand over it, not leaving, not saving himself first. The flames reflected gold in his amber eyes, and in that impossible, breathless second, Cale felt a cold certainty move through him. This dog had stood inside fire before. He lunged forward, dragged the collie's gate open, and hauled the trembling animal half by the harness, half by its own blind terror. Voss backed with them, step for step, refusing to bolt ahead. Only when the collie found its legs and stumbled toward safety did the shepherd finally break and move. Kyle counted as he pushed the last dogs into the main hall. 1, 2, 4, 7. Not enough. Mara came barreling back with a fire extinguisher and a blanket wrapped around her shoulders. Her face had gone white beneath the freckles across her nose. "The truck's coming!" "How many are out?" Kyle shouted. She looked around, eyes frantic, counting bodies and empty leads and open crate doors. "Not all of them." He knew. The ones missing were not random. Even in smoke and noise, even with alarms starting to scream overhead, the pattern remained intact. The empty kennels were not the weakest dogs or the easiest panickers. They were the valuable ones. Strong builds, good nerves, the kind of animal someone could sell, retrain, weaponize, or disappear into private hands and call it placement. The realization landed in him with ugly clarity. The fire was not for destruction. It was for cover. Sirens began somewhere far down the road, thin at first, then stronger. Red light pulsed against the snow outside. Staff from the upstairs rooms poured into the hall in confusion and fear. Mara was coughing now, trying to calm loose dogs while staring at the open gap in the back line, as if she could force the missing animals to reappear by refusing to blink. Kyle looked once toward the rear exit, now choked with smoke and night. He had come here because he suspected something hidden was moving beneath the surface of this shelter. Tonight, it had stepped into the fire and shown its outline. And Voss, standing in the hall with ash dusting his sable back and breath coming hard but controlled, had seen it all without looking surprised. The first engine pulled into the lot. Kyle stood in the red wash of emergency lights, chest burning from smoke, and watched the open rear door swing once in the winter wind before settling half-closed. The operation was real. It was organized. And now it knew, whether it realized it or not, that someone inside had finally started watching in the right direction. The fire left a smell that would not leave with the smoke. By morning, the shelter looked as if it had survived a bad dream and was trying to pretend it had only lost sleep. The rear wing was sealed off with temporary tape and folding barriers, but the scent of scorched plastic, wet ash, and extinguished fuel still drifted through the building in thin, bitter threads. It clung to blankets, to kennel bars, to the cuffs of coats. Even the clean cold outside could not entirely wash it off. Snow had fallen again before dawn, soft and thorough, laying a white sheet over the parking lot and the back fence, as if the night had tried to erase itself. But not everything had been covered in time. Kyle stood just outside the rear exit with his hands in the pockets of his old combat pants, looking at the ground the way some men looked at confession. His work boots sank half an inch into the fresh crust. The air hurt his lungs on the way in. To his left, the burned service door hung slightly warped on its hinges, blackened along the lower edge. To his right, the fence ran toward the tree line in a straight, practical line, ending where the pines began, and the world turned secret. He had slept less than an hour. The old military watch on his wrist still carried a thin gray dust in the seam near the clasp. He had not cleaned it. Some part of him did not want to. Evidence mattered, even when it was no longer official evidence, and had become something quieter, a private reminder that instinct had been right before certainty had caught up. Behind him, the shelter stirred with a different kind of mourning than usual. There was no cheerful routine now, no hopeful voices. Dogs barked because they smelled disruption. Volunteers spoke too softly. Every metal latch sounded louder than it should have. Grief had not entered the building exactly, but violation had. Mara came out through the side hall door holding a paper cup of coffee she seemed to have forgotten to drink. She looked worse than she had the previous night. Her face had the dull shock of someone whose exhaustion had moved beyond tiredness and into a colder place. The freckles across her pale cheeks stood out more sharply. Her brown hair, hastily retied, was still threaded with ash that had escaped her efforts to wash it out. She wore the same quilted vest over a thermal shirt, but her movements had lost some of their efficient rhythm. She looked like a woman who had spent years protecting a place, only to discover that harm had been living inside it, wearing ordinary shoes. "They'll be here in 20 minutes, she said. "Who?" "The deputy, and an insurance investigator later." Kyle glanced at her. "Silas?" Her mouth tightened around the name. "He called at 6:30, said he was devastated, said he'd do anything to help." Kyle looked back toward the snow. Anything. Men like Silas always loved that phrase. It made generosity sound expensive, while revealing nothing of what it actually cost. Mara followed his gaze downward. "You see something?" "Yes." She waited. Kyle crouched without answering. Just beyond the sweep of the rear door, under the partial shelter of the overhang, where the last snow had not fully settled, the old tracks remained. Faint, but enough. Tire tread with deep winter grooves, not one vehicle, at least two sets overlapping near the gate path. Boot impressions as well, partly degraded, heading toward and away from the opening beside the service entrance. And there were drag marks, not large enough for crates, not heavy enough for equipment, leashes, bodies, movement under resistance. Mara saw them a second later and inhaled sharply. "Those weren't there yesterday." "They were," Kyle said. "The snow just hadn't made them visible yet." He traced the line of the marks with his eyes, following them to a shallower impression near the fence where the snow had been disturbed more violently, as if animals had shifted weight there, uncertain and unwilling, before being pushed onward. Mara wrapped both hands around the untouched coffee cup. "You think they loaded them out here?" "I think they already knew where to stop." That landed hard. He could feel it without looking at her. Inside the building, a dog started barking in sudden, repetitive bursts, and then stopped. Somewhere else, another answered once, then thought better of it. The shelter sounded like a place trying to decide whether the danger had ended or merely changed form. Kyle rose and brushed snow from one knee. "Where's Voss?" "In the intake run. I moved him there after the fire. He wouldn't settle in the regular kennel wing." "He turned at once," Mara noticed. "You think he'll show you something?" Kyle started toward the side entrance. I think he already has. The intake run was smaller than the main kennel line, quieter, more enclosed. Dogs were usually kept there when they were new, sick, or unstable enough to need fewer eyes on them. The room held a stale warmth that smelled of disinfectant and anxious fur. The fluorescent lighting was harsher. It flattened everything. Voss stood the moment Cale came in. The shepherd looked unchanged at first glance, but the fire had left traces. There was a darkened singe line along the outer fur of one shoulder. A patch near the harness strap had been clipped by flame, and now sat uneven. His amber eyes looked brighter in the cramped room. Not softer, just more exposed. He seemed too large for the intake kennel, too deliberate to belong in a place meant for confusion. He did not pace. He did not bark. He watched. Kyle stopped outside the gate. Voss's attention went immediately to his hands. The morning after violence often stripped away performance. Men stopped pretending. Animals did too. Kyle did not try to speak to him. He simply unlatched the kennel, slow enough to be seen, and stepped back. Voss did not come forward at once. For 3 long seconds he held still, ears high, body angled halfway between suspicion and decision. Then he moved out of the kennel with that same contained precision that made him feel less like a domestic animal than a soldier who had once belonged to some stricter order. Kyle led him through the rear corridor and out into the cold. At the threshold, Voss stopped. His nose lifted, the air shifted through him. Kyle had seen trained dogs work before, but this was not training in the glossy civilian sense. There was nothing eager about it, nothing showy. Voss did not scan for praise. He did not look back for permission. He inhaled once, twice, then lowered his head and moved toward the tracks, as if some door in him had quietly opened. Mara stayed several paces behind, silent now. Voss followed the disturbed snow to the fence line, then veered left, away from the clearest tire marks, choosing instead a narrower route along the outer wall where the drifts were shallower and the footprints more broken. Kyle let the leash hang loose. The shepherd paused beside a dark smear near the cinderblock foundation and stood rigid. Kyle crouched. It was not blood, not quite. Melted soot mixed with oil, rubbed off against the wall by fabric or glove leather. But embedded near it was something else, barely visible. A small thread caught in rough concrete. Deep charcoal wool. Fine quality. Not a shelter jacket. Mara saw it and whispered, "That looks expensive." Kyle did not answer, but his thoughts had already moved ahead to the memory of Silas Vane's coat the day before the fire charcoal. Tailored, immaculate. The kind of garment not built for physical labor, only for power performed at close range. Voss moved again. He followed the line to the side lot, where fresh snow had preserved less, and suggestion mattered more than shape. Near the outer gate, he suddenly went still, every muscle drawn taut under the cream gray and sable coat. Kyle looked up. On the fence post nearest the service lane, almost hidden beneath frost, was a scrape mark in the paint. Fresh. Horizontal. At the height, a metal latch or crate corner might strike if shoved through quickly in the dark. It was nothing on its own. This morning, everything was nothing on its own. That was how systems like this survived. As Cale straightened, Voss turned his head sharply, not towards the gate, not toward the road, but back toward the shelter itself. His eyes locked on the second-floor office window above the rear hall. For one strange second, he stared so intently that Kyle followed the gaze without thinking. There was no one there, only the faint reflection of daylight over glass. Then Voss gave a low sound in his throat. Not a growl, not fear, something more uncertain and inward, like recognition brushing against memory. Kyle felt a pulse of unease move through him. The dog was not tracking only scent. He was measuring the place against something he already knew had happened inside it. By late morning, the deputy arrived. Deputy Cole Brannigan looked young enough to make the badge on his winter jacket seem slightly unfair, as if the town had dressed an earnest farm boy-in-law and told him to look convincing. He was around 30, broad through the shoulders without true heaviness, with fair skin reddened by cold, a serious mouth, and sandy brown hair cut short under a dark patrol cap. His face was open in the way people from small towns often were until experience taught them not to be. There was no cruelty in him, but there was caution, and beneath it the particular fatigue of local authority. Too many domestic disputes, too many drunk drivers, too many minor disasters that never turned into the kind of case he had secretly imagined justice should be. He removed one glove and shook Mara's hand first. "I'm sorry. I know this place means a lot to folks." Mara nodded once, too tired for courtesy. Cole listened carefully to her account, took notes, and did the right things in the right order. He walked the rear corridor. He looked at the damaged door. He examined the site where the fire had started. But Cale could see within minutes that the deputy was filtering this disaster through the logic most familiar to him. Negligence, opportunism, a local worker trying to steal what could be sold quickly. Not a wider system. Not yet. When Mara mentioned missing dogs, his jaw tightened. When Kyle mentioned the track pattern outside, he listened. But when Silas Vane's name entered the air, even indirectly, something in his expression changed. Not trust. Reflex. "Silas?" Cole repeated. "He's been helping this shelter stay open for 3 winters." Kyle leaned one shoulder against the office door frame. "That makes him useful, not innocent." Cole's eyes moved to him then, measuring. "And you are?" "Volunteer trainer." The deputy looked at the old tactical shirt, the military watch, the boots, the face that had forgotten how to be decorative years ago. "Right." It was not disbelief exactly, more a note filed for later. Cale did not push harder. Men like Cole never followed force well when pride stood in the way. Better to let doubt arrive by accumulation. Mara, to her credit, said quietly, "The paperwork's wrong too." That drew the deputy back. "What paperwork?" For the next half hour, the 3 of them stood in the office while wind rattled the windows and dogs shifted restlessly down the hall. Mara spread out transfer forms. Cale pointed to inconsistent destination fields, mismatched transport codes, missing signatures. Cole frowned deeper with each page. Not convinced yet, but moving. Outside, snow kept falling in light, careful strokes, covering the world without ever making it cleaner. When the discussion ended, Kyle stepped back into the intake room where Voss had been returned. The shepherd was standing again. No pacing, no whining, just stillness. Kyle stayed on the opposite side of the kennel door and let the silence lengthen. Then, without thinking too much about why, he raised one hand slightly, not as a command. Only an unconscious pause, fingers turned inward. Voss's attention sharpened instantly. It lasted only a moment, but it was there. Total. Focused. Almost painful in its intensity. Kyle lowered his hand. The dog remained where he was, but something invisible between them had shifted. Not into trust, not even into understanding, but into possibility. Outside the intake window, the sky had gone the color of old tin. Somewhere in the building, Mara was explaining something again to Deputy Brannigan, her tired voice steadying itself by sheer effort. The shelter held its damage like a bruised body, learning where it hurt most. Kyle looked at Voss and felt the shape of the truth becoming harder and more dangerous at once. The fire had not been the plan. The fire had been the mask. And the dog in front of him had not merely survived the night. He had recognized it. By the 3rd night after the fire, the shelter had learned how to look normal again. That was what unsettled Cale most, not the damage itself. Damage was honest. Burned metal smelled like burned metal. Paperwork with holes in it looked guilty when you held it up to the light. But institutions, small ones especially, places run on routine and trust, and the daily exhaustion of decent people had a way of reshaping themselves around violence faster than the people inside them could. By day, the adoption desk was back in place. The intake forms had been restacked. Replacement blankets had arrived in flattened cardboard boxes. Volunteers spoke softer than usual, but they still spoke in the language of rescue. Progress, healing, tomorrow, placement. Only the rear hall still carried the truth openly. Even after cleaning, even after cold air had moved through the building in long gray breaths, the scent of smoke lingered in the seams of the walls. A bitter trace remained in the concrete, in the rubber kennel mats, in the metal doorframe where the heat had warped the hinge. Some nights, when the building settled and the heaters clicked on, the smell rose again, as if memory itself had been baked into the place. Kyle returned anyway. He had become part of the rhythm so carefully that nobody looked twice when he signed in for another late shift. Mara did not question him now. That, more than her words, told him how frightened she had become. She still moved with the same practical steadiness, still tied her brown hair back without vanity, still carried clipboards and feed buckets and sorrow, as if none of them were heavier than the others. But a fracture had opened under her composure. He could see it in the way she checked locks twice, in the way she stood listening after every unexpected sound. Cole had come through once that afternoon, asking for copies, promising follow-up, trying to wear authority more confidently than he felt. His fair young face had remained serious, but something in him had shifted. The local instinct to protect the familiar had begun losing ground to evidence. He was not yet fully on Cale's side. He was, however, no longer comfortably on anyone else's. That was enough for now. Outside, the cold had sharpened. A storm had passed east, leaving the night clear and vicious, with stars like ice chips caught in black glass. Every footstep in the lot rang through the crusted snow. Every breath came out white and vanished immediately. Inside, Kyle kept moving. He fed dogs, checked bowls, latched kennels, carried himself with the same contained calm that made him useful and forgettable at once. But underneath it, his mind was narrower tonight, harder. The pattern had become too clear to mistake for coincidence. The rear gate, the wrong paperwork, the altered transfers, the fine wool fiber caught in cinder block, Nate's constant drifting near the back wing, Silas Vane's immaculate concern by daylight and invisible presence at the edges of darkness. Still, suspicion was only suspicion, until it moved. Cale intended to see it move. He found Voss in the intake run again. The German shepherd stood when he appeared, but did not come forward. The dog's sable coat had regained some of its shape after the fire, though one dark patch along the shoulder still sat uneven where the fur had singed and been trimmed back. The black harness with the dark red edging remained fitted cleanly to his body, making him look less like a shelter dog and more like something still assigned to a purpose no one else could read. His amber eyes moved first, as always, to Cale's hands, then to the old military watch on his wrist, then up briefly to his face. There was no softness in him, but there was no vacancy either. That mattered. Cale did not reach toward the kennel. He did not speak. The quiet between them was no longer empty now, it had structure. The dog recognized him, if not as safety, then at least as a fixed point in the shelter's changing weather. "Still awake?" Mara asked from behind him. He glanced back. She looked worn thin by the weak, pale skin roughened by sleeplessness, shadows beneath the eyes, vest zipped crooked in a way that meant she had dressed while thinking about something else. She carried a tray of medication cups for the older dogs. "Thought you went upstairs." I will. She hesitated. You were right. Kyle waited. About this not being over. Her voice stayed level through effort. I checked the shift logs. Nate asked twice this week to cover the back wing alone, said he liked the quiet. Kyle looked once more at Voss. People who like quiet usually don't create this much noise. That drew a tired, humorless smile out of her. If you see anything tonight, I'll wake you, he said. It was close enough to a promise that she accepted it. By 11, the shelter had fallen into its nighttime breathing again. Somewhere in the far kennel line, a shepherd mix gave one warning bark at nothing visible, and then settled. The old pipes clicked. Wind moved against the siding like someone testing it with a flat hand. Kyle made another slow circuit of the interior, then positioned himself near the supply room off the rear corridor where he could watch the service entrance without standing in open sight. He waited. Waiting had once been easier when he was younger. Back then, patience had felt like action stored. Now it felt closer to age, understanding how often the right choice was the one that made you feel weak while you were making it. At 11:42, the rear camera feed glitched. At 11:47, the office printer kicked on for no reason and spat out a single blank page. At 11:51, footsteps crossed the corridor light, quick, familiar. Nate. He moved with the same false, careful rhythm Kyle had come to recognize, the rhythm of someone trying to imitate normalcy without belonging to it. Under the corridor light, Nate's narrow face looked more pinched than before, his jaw shadow rough, his pale skin gray with fatigue. He carried a lead in one hand and kept glancing over his shoulder, not because he had heard something, but because guilt had trained him to expect it. Kyle stayed where he was, hidden by the half-open supply door. Nate unlocked the intake run. Voss did not resist. That was the first hard blow. The shepherd rose at once, not eager, not trusting, but responsive in a way that hit Kyle with cold clarity. This was not new to him. The dog's body knew the sequence. Late hour, quiet corridor, leash, rear route. Recognition moved through Voss, not as comfort, but as old conditioning. He stepped out with his head low and eyes alert, neither fighting nor accepting, simply entering a pattern he had already survived before. Kyle's hand tightened once against the doorframe. Everything in him wanted to stop it there. One move, 2 steps. Strike the wrist, disarm the lead, pin Nate against the wall, recover the dog, call Cole, force the next layer into daylight. But the next layer was the point. If he moved too soon, he would save one animal and lose the rest. Lose the route. Lose the buyers or handlers waiting beyond the gate. Lose the proof that could make men like Silas untouchable again by morning. The logic was clean. The feeling of it was not. Nate led Voss down the rear corridor and out through the service exit. Kyle counted to 3 and followed. The cold outside hit like punishment. Snow had crusted over earlier tracks, but tonight the path was fresh. Kyle kept to the darker edge of the wall, moving inside the blind spots he had mapped 2 shifts ago. Ahead, Nate crossed the side lane toward the fence gap, where the wire had been loosened, and retied so carefully it vanished in daylight. Beyond it, in the tree line, a vehicle waited with its lights off. Not large enough to be a transport truck, a transfer step only. Intermediate. Kyle dropped lower behind the woodpile stacked along the boundary and watched. There were 3 men. Nate. One driver broad, heavy through the shoulders, wearing a dark parka and knit cap, his beard thick enough to swallow half his lower face. Even from a distance he moved like a man accustomed to lifting weight and taking orders, not giving them. The third stood closer to the rear hatch. Thinner, taller, posture nervy and restless, cigarette ember pulsing once in the dark before he crushed it under his boot. Late 30s, maybe. Hollow-cheeked, long nose, bad posture, the shape of a man who had traded nerve for money enough times that his body had learned to live in apology. No Silas. Of course not. Men like Silas rarely touched the dirt they profited from. The broad man opened the hatch. Metal crate doors gleamed faintly inside. Not empty. Prepared. Nate offered the lead across. Voss stopped. Not dramatically, not enough to force anyone's hand, but enough for Cale to see the tension run through him. The dog's ears shifted. His weight went back one fraction. Not refusal memory against fear. Then the thinner man made a sharp gesture with 2 fingers and a jerk of his wrist. Voss moved. Kyle felt something cold and ugly settle deeper in his chest. Not just voice, then. Not just routine. Signals, handling language, a stripped-down system of command used often enough to overwrite instinct. As the broad man leaned to fit the lead through the crate ring, Voss turned his head sharply, not toward the men, not toward the vehicle, but toward the darkness where Kyle lay hidden behind the stacked wood. It was only for a second, a clean, direct look through the gaps between branches and frozen air. Amber eyes found him. No bark, no movement, no plea. Yet something in that glance landed harder than any noise could have. Kyle could not tell whether the dog had smelled him, sensed him, or simply recognized another witness in the dark. But in that one silent meeting of eyes, the shelter, the fire, the paperwork, the whole carefully hidden machine behind this place became personal in a way it had not been before. Then the moment was gone. Voss let himself be turned toward the crate. Kyle did not move. The broad man shut the hatch. The vehicle rolled out slow at first, tires grinding over packed snow, then turned toward the narrow service road that led away from town and into the woods beyond the ridge. Nate climbed into the passenger side of a second truck that had been parked farther back in shadow. The 2 vehicles separated at the fork 20 yards down, one west, one north. Kyle stayed down until both tail lights had disappeared. Only then did he exhale. His pulse was steady. Years of training made sure of that. But steadiness was not the same thing as certainty. He could feel the choice he had just made beginning to bruise him from the inside. He had not saved Voss. He had chosen the road instead. That was the sort of decision people praised only when it worked. He rose slowly and stepped out from cover. The snow near the crates carried fresh impressions: boot prints, tire compression, a torn corner from a shipping label, no bigger than a thumbnail. He picked it up with gloved fingers and turned it toward the starlight. A partial code. Numbers. Not enough yet, but something. Behind him the shelter stood dark and still, its roofline pale under snow, windows reflecting a sky that gave nothing back. Kyle looked toward the road the vehicles had taken and began the walk back inside, already turning over distances, routes, time windows, county lines. He would need maps. Coal. Maybe not tonight, not until he had enough to force belief past loyalty. But soon. Inside the rear hall, the smell of ash met him again. A building still wounded. A place still pretending it was only tired. Mara had fallen asleep in the upstairs office chair after all, a blanket around her shoulders, one lamp left on beside a pile of transfer files. Kyle did not wake her. Instead, he stood for a long moment in the empty intake room, where Voss's kennel door now hung open, shadow laying black bars over the concrete floor. The room felt wrong without the dog in it. Not sad. Exposed. Kyle put the torn label scrap into his pocket. He had crossed a line tonight. Until now, he had been proving suspicion. Observing rot. Gathering shape and scent and pattern. Tonight he had watched the system take what it believed already belonged to it, and let it happen because stopping the hand was not the same as cutting off the arm behind it. The cost of that choice sat in him like swallowed iron. When he finally turned out the hall light and faced the dark window at the end of the corridor, He knew two things, with a certainty deeper than evidence. First, the network was bigger than one frightened employee and one generous donor with perfect manners. Second, Voss had walked into that vehicle because this had happened to him before, and now Kyle had chosen to follow the truth all the way to the place where it lived. Kyle did not go upstairs after the trucks disappeared into the dark. He stayed in the rear hall until dawn, standing in the intake room where Voss's kennel sat open and empty, the silence inside it far louder than barking would have been. The cold from the corridor windows crept across the concrete floor and settled in the room inch by inch, but he barely felt it. What he felt instead was the shape of the choice he had made, still hard and unfinished inside his chest. He had let them take the dog. There were choices men talked about later with clear words and straight spines, as if necessity made them clean. Kyle knew better than that. Necessary choices were often filthy at the edges. They left residue. They sat in the body like smoke in cloth. By first light, he had maps spread across Mara's office desk, a torn shipping label on top of them, and a second cup of bad coffee going cold by his hand. The label fragment had only part of a code, a partial contractor stamp, and the first two letters of a county abbreviation. Not enough to prove anything in a courtroom. Enough to narrow distance, direction, and habit. Mara came in while he was still staring at it. She looked like she had slept without actually resting, her pale face drawn thin, freckles faded beneath fatigue. She had changed her shirt, but not her expression. There was a stiffness in the way she held her shoulders now, as if the shelter itself had become something she could no longer fully trust and was trying to protect anyway. "You didn't wake me," she said quietly. "No." "Did something happen?" Kale looked up at her, then back at the torn scrap in his hand. For a second, he considered giving her the gentler version, the one that kept fear at a manageable size. But fear was already here. It had already burned through a wing of her shelter and carried living things out the back. "They took Voss," he said. The words struck her harder because he spoke them so flatly. Mara's fingers tightened around the file folder she was carrying. "You saw them?" "Yes." "And you let them go?" There it was. Not accusation, exactly. Not yet. Shock first. The human hunger to believe action should always be immediate, if care is real. Kyle stood. In daylight, with maps and coffee and office light instead of night and snow and moving shadows, the explanation sounded colder than it had felt. There were two vehicles, at least 3 men. They were ready for transport. If I stepped out, I could have maybe stopped one hand, not the machine behind it. Mara stared at him. Her brown eyes filled, not with tears, but with the anger people wear when grief doesn't yet know where to stand. She turned away and put the folder on the desk too hard. For a while, neither of them spoke. Then she said, still facing the filing cabinet, "If you're right, bring him back." Kyle did not answer with a promise. Men in his life had made too many promises that were just fear dressed up to sound useful. He only said, "Help me find the dead man." She turned. "What?" "The original owner." By noon, they had his name. It came not from the shelter database, which had been scrubbed just enough to seem incomplete rather than altered, but from a box of archived paper surrender records stored in Mara's cramped back room. Those files smelled of cardboard, dust, and old winters. Most people trusted digital systems because they seemed orderly. Kyle trusted what people forgot to destroy. The file was thin. Elias Rowan. The surname hit Kale first, sharp and strange, like hearing an echo in an empty place. No relation he knew of, but enough to make the dead man feel closer already. The intake note listed Elias as deceased, no next of kin, residence outside town near an old service road, Emergency transfer of surviving animal after fire-related fatality. The attached details were sparse, but one line stood out. Owner was hearing impaired. Communication methods unknown. Mara read it twice. That should have mattered. It did, Kyle said. To the wrong people. Cole came an hour later, shrugging out of the cold with his patrol jacket dusted in snow. He looked rougher now than when he had first arrived after the fire. Cheeks wind-burned, hair flattened from his cap, jaw shadow darker, eyes more tired. There was something painfully decent about him. Small-town men who chose public duty often learned too late that integrity did not protect them from being made fools of. He took one look at the maps, the archive box, and Mara's face, and understood the room had moved beyond ordinary procedure. "What did you find?" he asked. Kyle showed him the label scrap, the county letters, the transfer code mismatch, the Elias file. Cole read in silence, his serious mouth flattened. "You think the owner knew something?" "I think the dog learned something in that house," Kyle said. Cole looked up. "You really believe this comes back to the dog?" "It already has." There was skepticism in him still, but it had changed flavor. Less dismissal now, more resistance to the shape of the conclusion. That was progress. By mid-afternoon, the three of them drove out to Elias Rowan's property. It sat at the end of a narrow road half-eaten by winter, where the trees grew dense and the air seemed older than town air. The house, or what remained of it, stood back from the road under a stand of dark pines. Fire had taken most of the roof months earlier. Snow lay over the ruin in smooth white plains broken by black beams and collapsed stone. Nothing about it looked dramatic anymore. That was what made it sad. Ruin settled fastest when no one remained to witness it. Kyle stepped out first. The cold there was more absolute than near town. It seemed to strip sound away before it could travel. Even Cole lowered his voice without meaning to. Mara wrapped her arms across her chest and stayed near the truck, eyes moving over the ruin as if she could still feel heat stored somewhere inside it. Kyle moved through the shell of the house carefully. Charred beams, frosted nails, burnt plaster. The smell was old smoke now, mixed with snowmelt and wet ash. In what had once been the kitchen, he found melted glass pooled against stone. In the back room, he found what might have been a dog bed frame. In the study or something that had served as one. He stopped. A desk had collapsed sideways against the wall, but one lower drawer remained wedged shut beneath fallen timber. He knelt, braced one hand against blackened wood, and pulled. It came loose with a groan of damp, warped material and a small rain of soot. Inside lay a metal cash box scorched along the edges. Cole crouched beside him. "You've done this before." Kyle did not look at him. "Finding what fire misses?" "Yes." The box had no lock anymore. Inside were property papers, an old firefighter service card with Elias Rowan's photograph, half-burned but still legible, and beneath them, wrapped in oilcloth, a notebook. Mara made a small sound in her throat when Kyle unfolded it. The pages were smoke-stained but intact. They were filled not with ordinary training notes but with hand sketches, gestures, repeated finger positions, arrows showing direction. Beside some were short-written cues in a tight, disciplined hand. Wait, stay, quiet, down, watch, danger, no trust. Near the back, boxed in dark pencil, was another phrase. Stand, strike, no retreat. Cole exhaled slowly. Jesus, Cale turned the page. There, tucked between notes on feeding and winter paw care, was a photograph. Elias Rowan stood in front of the same house before the fire, broad through the chest despite age, hair mostly gray, face weathered and square, one side marked by old burn scars disappearing into the collar of his flannel shirt. He was not a handsome man, but there was steadiness in him, the kind that came from surviving pain without building a religion out of it. Beside him sat a younger Voss, same amber eyes, same sable coat, same intense attention fixed not on the camera, but on Elias's raised hand. Not voice. Hand. Language. As Cale held the photo, something loosened unexpectedly in him. Not memory, exactly. More like recognition traveling backward through another man's life. The old firefighter's hand in the picture was angled in a sign Kyle had seen before, without understanding it. Once in the shelter corridor when Nate moved without speaking. Once in the night beside the transport crate, when the thin man flicked 2 fingers, and Voss obeyed. It was there in still form, preserved by a dead man's ordinary mourning. For one silent second, standing in the charred bones of the house, Kyle had the eerie sense that Elias Rowan had not lost everything to fire, after all. He had left behind the only witness who could still read him. Mara took the notebook like it might bruise. Her face had softened with something heavier than pity now. He taught him everything this way. Kyle nodded. Cole remained crouched, reading the notes over Cale's shoulder. And whoever took Voss learned enough of it to use against him. Enough to move him, Cale said. Not enough to own him. Back at the shelter after dark, Kyle sat alone in the intake room with the notebook open on his knee. The room had gone quiet around him. Outside the barred window, snow moved lazily through the security light like pale insects. The open kennel still looked wrong without the dog in it, wrong enough to sharpen concentration. He studied the gestures. Elias's handwriting was firm, practical, stripped of ornament. A firefighter's notes, a working man's language. Some of the signs were simple adaptations. Others were more specific rhythms rather than shapes, the speed of fingers meaning as much as the hand form itself. Kyle tried one. Nothing, of course. No dog here to answer. He tried another, slower. Then the boxed phrase again. Stand, strike, no retreat. He watched his own hand in the dim reflection of the kennel glass, and saw at once why this language would not bend easily to imitation. It was not only position, it was intention. A command given in the wrong body became empty motion. The office door opened softly. Cole stepped in, carrying 2 cups of vending machine coffee. Figured you were still here. Cale accepted one. Cole looked around the intake room, then at the notebook. Mara ran the county letters on the label. There's an old agricultural storage lease outside Black Hollow under a transport company shell. Company traces back to 2 dissolved holdings. He hesitated. One of them touches vein development. Kyle looked up. Cole held his gaze this time without flinching. Not enough for arrest. Enough for me to stop calling this theory. For a long moment, neither man spoke. Then Kyle lifted his hand and repeated the boxed sign from the notebook, slowly, carefully, in the empty air between them. Cole watched it, confused. What was that? Kyle lowered his hand. Maybe the last thing that ever worked on him. He meant Voss, but the room felt full of Elias Rowan, too, the dead firefighter whose house had burned, whose dog had been stolen by familiarity, whose hands had taught a language no one at the shelter had bothered to ask about, until it was too late. Kyle closed the notebook and stood. The path ahead was no longer a blur of instinct and broken clues. It had narrowed. Not become safe, just legible. Voss had not been silent. They had simply been speaking around him in the wrong tongue. Black Hollow did not look like a place where living things should be kept. The road narrowed the farther they drove, until it became less a road than a memory of 1-2 frozen tracks between stands of dark pine and old fencing swallowed by snow. The trees here were taller than those near town, older too, and the wind moved through them with a sound like breath dragged through teeth. The warehouse sat at the end of the lane behind a collapsed loading scale and a chain-link fence that had once tried to suggest order. Now it only suggested neglect. Kyle cut the engine and let the silence settle. Beside him, Deputy Cole Brannigan stared through the windshield, one gloved hand resting near the dash, the other near the holster at his side. Under the weak dome light, his young face looked harsher than it had at the shelter, less open. The cold had reddened his skin again, but his eyes were steady now. Not convinced merely by documents or codes anymore, convinced by accumulation, by the ugly weight of too many things fitting together. Still time to wait for backup, Cole said quietly. Kyle looked out at the warehouse. The building was long, low, and corrugated, with a roofline bent by winters and neglect. One exterior light above the loading door had burned out long ago. Another farther down flickered with a tired yellow pulse that did not fully reach the ground. No signage, no marked trucks. The kind of place designed not to be remembered after it had been used. If we wait, Cale said, they move. Cole knew he was right. That was the problem. They had enough now to make the place matter. Shell companies linked to Silas Vane, old lease records, transport discrepancies, local transfers routed through false destinations. Enough for warrants if time allowed. But time never seemed to belong to people trying to stop harm. It always belonged first to those creating it. Cole exhaled once. I'm going in with you. Kyle nodded. He stepped out into the cold. It seized his lungs with that clean, violent northern sharpness that always felt honest. Snow creaked under his old work boots. His tactical shirt sat beneath a dark field jacket now, but the familiar weight of the old military watch at his wrist grounded him more than the firearm hidden at his back. Habit mattered in places like this. Rhythm mattered. Breathing mattered. He had practiced the signs from Elias Rowan's notebook until his fingers felt stupid with repetition. Not only shape, timing, intention, the language of a man who had spent years speaking through motion because sound had abandoned him. He had not mastered it, but he had learned enough to stop lying to himself about what it required. At the side entrance, Cale cut the chain with bolt cutters Mara had borrowed from the shelter's maintenance shed, without asking what he planned to do with them. The metal gave with a muted snap. Cole slid in behind him, service weapon drawn low. The smell hit first. Not gasoline this time. Dog fur, old straw, metal, industrial cleaner, stale heat, fear. Then the sound. Whining, low and constant. Nails against crate floors, the occasional sharp bark quickly silenced by exhaustion. Beneath it all, the hum of one working generator somewhere deeper in the building. Kyle moved ahead. The first room had once been a storage bay. Now it held stacked cages, plastic bins of leads and muzzles, a folding table with paperwork and sedative supplies, and 3 transport crates standing empty against the far wall. Snowmelt had dried in dirty half-moons on the concrete near the door. Fresh tracks, recent use. Cole crouched at the table and thumbed through a ledger. Names coded, weights, notes on bite risk. Take it, Kyle said. Then he heard it. Not barking, not whining, a single hard impact from farther inside. Metal struck once, then stilled. Kyle knew before he rounded the next partition. Voss. The holding room beyond was longer, narrower, hotter. Portable heaters had been set at intervals, turning the air stale and close. Dogs were crated along both walls, shepherds, mixes, hounds, 2 young retrievers with panic glassing their eyes. At the far end stood Voss in a transport enclosure, large enough for movement, but not escape. He looked thinner than he had at the shelter, not from time, from stress. His sable coat still carried the singed scar of the fire along one shoulder, and his black harness with the deep red trim remained on him, as if whoever handled him had already decided he belonged to logistics more than to mercy. His amber eyes found Kyle instantly, but he did not come forward. He stood rigid, weight back, chest tight, every line of him caught between recognition and old command. Kyle stopped several feet from the crate. Cole was somewhere behind him, speaking into the radio at last, low and controlled, calling in location and requesting immediate support. The signal crackled. Patchy. Good enough, maybe. Or maybe not. Voss's gaze dropped to Cale's hands. Cale did not speak. He let the room settle around them. The other dogs rustled, whimpered, shifted. Metal clicked somewhere beyond the wall. Time contracted. Then slowly, carefully, he raised one hand. Wait. Voss's ears twitched. Nothing else. Cale adjusted, lowered the hand, shifted angle. Quiet. This time the dog's eyes sharpened. His body did not move, but the attention changed, less defensive, more focused, as if an old door had opened half an inch in a dark house. Cole came up beside him. We need to move. Kyle did not look away from Voss. 3 seconds. He tried again. No trust. The sign felt wrong in his hand at first. Too rigid, too much command and not enough meaning. He softened the motion the way Elias's notes suggested. Less force. More warning. Voss took one step forward inside the crate. That was enough to prove the bridge existed. Then the warehouse door behind them crashed open. 2 men came in fast. The broad handler first, heavy and forward-driven, beard thick under the edge of his black knit cap, dark parka stretching across his shoulders. He moved like a man used to controlling mass dogs, crates, bodies. The thinner one followed with the same apologetic posture Kyle had seen at the transfer point, long face drawn tight now with adrenaline and malice. In his hand was a catchpole. Cole pivoted immediately, weapon up. Sheriff's office, drop it. The broad man did not drop anything. He charged. The room exploded into motion. Cole fired once into the concrete beside the man's boot, not to kill, to stop momentum. It worked for half a second. Then the thinner handler swung the pole toward Cole's arm, knocking his aim wide. Kyle moved before the impact finished. He struck the thinner man in the throat with the edge of his forearm, pivoted, and drove a hard elbow into the broad man's jaw. Pain shot up his own shoulder. The bigger man barely staggered. He was strong, too strong to handle cleanly. Cole went down to one knee, wrestling the catchpole free. The thinner handler recovered faster than he should have and lunged again. Kyle took the hit to the ribs, felt something hot and immediate flare under his jacket, and answered with a short, brutal strike to the side of the man's knee. Bone cracked or popped hard to tell. The man screamed and dropped. The broad handler slammed into Kyle and drove him backward into the crate line. Metal screamed. Dogs burst into frantic noise around them. Kyle got one hand under the man's coat and felt reinforced padding beneath it. Prepared. Not improvising. The broad man's fist caught the side of Cale's head and sent white light through his vision. He hit back on instinct, sharp, efficient, old violence returning without permission. And still the man kept coming. Across the room, Voss had backed into the far corner of the crate. Not cowering. Frozen. The old conditioning had him now. Noise. Men. Commands. Impact. 1,000 pieces of the past converging in one airless space. Kyle saw it in a flash between blows. Voss's body did not read this fight as rescue. He read it as the exact pattern that had stolen the world from him before. The dog's ears flattened, his chest locked, and for one terrible second he turned his head. Not away from Kyle. Not fully, but just enough to show how close he was to vanishing into that old inward silence again. Something inside Cale hardened. Not desperation. Clarity. If he failed now, it would not be because the dog did not understand him. It would be because he still had not learned how to speak to fear. The broad handler drove Cale into the wall. Air tore out of him. Somewhere to his left, Cole had gotten one cuff on the thinner man and was fighting to keep control as the man writhed and spat curses. The room narrowed. Kyle could feel blood warm under the fabric at his ribs, could hear the generator hum, the dogs crying, the broad handler's ragged breathing, could feel how little time remained before one mistake became the only thing that mattered. He shoved off the wall, twisted, took another blow, and dropped low enough to create one heartbeat of distance between himself and the man trying to break him. Then he looked straight at Voss, not at the crate, not at the room, at the dog, and with one hand shaking from impact, he gave the sign. Not rushed, not barked, not copied, stand, strike, no retreat. He put into it what Elias must have once put into it. Not force, but certainty. Not domination, but shared danger. The shape of a command, given only when there was no safe place left to go. For 1 second, nothing happened. For 2, Voss stared. For 3, his ears rose. Then the dog hit the crate door with everything in him. Kyle had not realized in the chaos that the broad man, in his rush, had failed to latch it fully after checking the transport locks. The door sprang loose under the impact. Voss came out like compressed silence released. No wild barking, no confusion, just direction. He drove low into the broad handler's side, not at the throat, not randomly, but exactly where balance breaks. The man shouted and staggered. Kyle took the opening instantly, 1 step in, 1 strike, 1 turn of weight, and sent him crashing to the concrete hard enough to drive the fight out of him. Across the room, Cole finished securing the thinner man. The warehouse went very still. Then a slow clap sounded from the doorway. Silas Vane stepped in as if arriving late to a dinner he had been told would still be warm. He wore the same kind of charcoal coat Kyle remembered from the shelter, the same composed expression, the same gloves that made his hands look almost ornamental. Under the weak overhead lights, his face seemed narrower, older, more openly cruel. He took in the room, the handlers down, the deputy bruised and breathing hard, Kyle bleeding through his jacket, Voss standing between the men and the crated dogs, and some last veil in him simply fell away. "So," Silas said softly, "you were never here to help them." Kyle wiped blood from the corner of his mouth with the back of one hand. "I was here to watch who thought they owned them." Silas's gaze shifted to Voss. That one was expensive. He said it with irritation, not emotion. Cole straightened, weapon raised again. "Silas Vane, put your hands where I can see them." Silas smiled, a small, ruined thing. "You have no idea how many people use what they pretend to protect." Then he made a sharp verbal command toward Voss. The dog did not so much as flick an ear. For the first time, true surprise crossed Silas's face. Not fear yet. Something worse for a man like him. Irrelevance. Outside, at last, tires crunched over snow. Back up. The sound seemed to empty the last resistance from the room. Silas lowered his chin slightly, as if acknowledging not defeat, exactly, but inconvenience. Cole moved in, cuffed him, and this time did not hesitate. When it was over, Cale sank against the crate line for one unguarded second and pressed a hand against his ribs. Voss stood 3 feet away, not approaching, not withdrawing. Watching. Ash and old hurt and instinct all still visible in him. But he had not turned away. He had chosen a direction. That mattered. Morning came slowly after that night. The shelter was quieter when Kyle returned. Not peaceful. Recovering. Mara met him in the kennel hall with sleepless eyes, and both hands over her mouth, when she saw Voss walk in beside him on a lead. Alive. She did not cry. She just touched the back of Voss's harness once, very gently, like someone confirming that truth had weight. There were statements, evidence boxes, state investigators, Cole moving through it all with a newer, steadier kind of authority. Silas was charged not only through the warehouse and transport records, but through the security access logs, shell holdings, and falsified transfer documentation that Mara had helped expose. It was not dramatic in the way movies liked justice to be. It was better. It was complete. A week later, after the shelter had begun to breathe like itself again, Coil came to the intake run one final time. The kennel door stood open. Voss stood inside, free to stay where he was. Kyle said nothing. He stepped close enough to be chosen or refused and raised one hand. Stay. Safe. With me. The motion was simple now, honest, not perfect, perhaps. But true. Voss held still for a long moment. Then he crossed the distance between them and placed his head, with all the weight of his history and all the caution of an animal who had learned what people could do, against Coil's hand. It was not obedience. It was the first clean yes either of them had been given in a very long time. Sometimes, a miracle does not arrive like thunder. Sometimes, it comes quietly, through a wounded heart that still chooses trust, through a hand raised at the right moment, through a life that was almost lost and still finds its way home. Maybe that is how God works in our lives too. Not always by removing the fire, not always by stopping the storm before it begins, but by leaving us a sign, a strength, a faithful companion, or one final moment of grace that helps us keep going when we thought we had nothing left. In everyday life, many people carry pain in silence. Some are waiting to be understood. Some are one act of kindness away from hope. Some are standing in the middle of their own dark season, wondering if heaven still sees them. This story is a reminder that God has not forgotten the broken, the quiet, or the overlooked. He still reaches into ruined places. He still writes mercy into impossible moments. And sometimes, the very thing the world gave up on becomes the proof that grace was there all along. If this story touched your heart, please share it with someone who may need hope tonight. Leave a comment and tell us where you are watching from, or what part of the story stayed with you most. And if you believe in stories of faith, healing, love, and second chances, subscribe to the channel and walk with us into the next story. May God bless you, protect your home, strengthen your heart, and place peace over every burden you are carrying. May He guide your steps, restore what feels lost, and let quiet miracles find you exactly when you need them most.